So welcome to another BBA Roundtable discussion where we're putting key questions to the assembled industry experts. So let's start off with the first question of the day, which is, as an industry, where are we in terms of utilising new technology or technologies to progress? And do we have the capabilities to capitalise on that potential? So first of all, let's go to you, Richard, Non-Executive Director of BBA. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the industry is very well positioned to improve, to make advances in both technology and in the way we systemise construction. But obviously, over the last few years, we've been tested quite heavily by COVID, and we've seen and learnt things we never expected from that. So, for example, having fewer people on a construction site actually improved productivity because people weren't getting in the way of each other. So I think we have to rethink how we deliver construction, and we have lots of opportunities for doing that, modularisation, off-site construction, etc. But underpinning all of this is a change in our culture. And that's where I think we still have a problem. We have lots of technology, whether that be information management, whether it be innovative products and systems, but we have to have a desire for change. And in an industry which is really risk averse because we operate on low margins, I think that's a challenge for us all.
Right, so you're talking about quite a few challenges. So Hardy, talking about some of those and thinking about some of those, Hardy Giesler, Chief Executive Officer with BBA. What are your thoughts?
Just to build on what Richard said, I think the drivers for change are starting to stack up. The housing challenge isn't going away, and arguably we've not met the target for many a year, so I would imagine that it's becoming more acute. Secondly, post-Brexit, as well as some other factors, the availability of labour in building the traditional way is becoming an issue, and that could encourage or should encourage us to look at other ways of constructing, modern methods of construction, off-site building, etc. So I hope that the drivers that we are becoming aware of will help to accelerate our awareness of a need for culture change. At the BBA, we feel we need to lead on this, and we have over the last 2.5 years been through some significant change with even more change planned for the next 2.5 years. So, people sitting around this table have all been involved to some degree in that journey, sometimes a little bit painful and sometimes very productive and helpful, thanks for that, but always looking forward to hearing more from our colleagues within the industry as to what we can do to help accelerate that process of change. So change seems to be a very strong theme here, doesn't it? So David, let's put you under the spot here. David Johnson, Technical Director with D-Gauge. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because listening to what you just said, I can totally go with the issue of risk being one of our biggest problems. My experience is that we are, as an industry, becoming more risk averse, I think possibly because we're more aware of the consequences of failure, for example. And I think that I've always found, particularly in my own industry, that there is a desire to be the second person to introduce something new rather than the first. And that always makes it a bit difficult because if you're not first, then who is going to be first? And I think we have an issue of how do we tackle the risk aversion that we have within industry when you look at, shall we say, the way in which we structure projects. How do we get to the point where someone says we will own a risk? How do we underwrite a risk at a level that's going to encourage people to take it? How are you going to build innovative practices in right from the start? So, for example, if you're looking at a contract, it's quite likely it will be costed up without any knowledge of what the state of play will be by the time the project comes to fruition, particularly given the long time frames for some projects. If a budget gets set that uses traditional technology and you get around to delivering it, what encouragement is there to do anything than use the traditional technology that's made that budget work in the first place? And I feel that the risk aversion side of it is something we've really got to tackle to make people actually get involved in that risk right from the beginning and feeding it through the process and make it safe in terms of, that yes, you're taking a risk, but what have we got to mitigate those risks along the way and what will be the consequences of failure?
And then the question we're talking about, how can we use technology or techniques to progress? So can I ask Anthony, from your perspective as Director of Business Development for Co-Builder, what technology and what techniques can we use and learn more from?
Well, I think from my perspective, I mean, the higher level is probably about behavioural change as an issue, I think. We've got people that don't want to change, and I suspect a lot of the drivers are going to be legislation. We need competent people doing the right things outside of legislation. I think people aren't willing to do the right things at the moment, they're waiting to be led. And I think that's where the government come in really. We've got many sort of drivers, construction playbook, we've got the building safety bill, all the rest of it. They've been mandated 2011, I mean that was what, many years ago now? There's people looking at that. So I think technology really, from my perspective, from my field, is about being data driven in your approach to making decisions. And I think what we're dealing with now is how do we communicate what is what? What am I describing and what do you hear? So sometimes I can describe something and I think I know what I'm talking about. You don't hear the same thing, so we're not comparing apples and apples, the usual thing. So I think it's describing what is what in a common language for construction is the big thing in my mind.
All right. And Emma, as Sales and Marketing Director for BBA, what can we learn from other sectors, other industry sectors?
So my previous background in rail shows that actually in industry there are similarities between the rail sector and construction in terms of old processes, embedded processes and culture that actually also need to be tackled alongside technology. So technology, there is trust needed in technology, and actually if you have a sector that doesn't trust it, doesn't understand it, it makes it very difficult for that to be embedded into a sector naturally and takes a lot of time. There's other factors such as cost and other prohibitive factors, but actually rail has started to make some of those changes and use technology to its advantage that I think are applicable within construction and something to learn from.
Yeah, so we can learn from other sectors.
Exactly.
In terms of cultural change and learning from others, I'm going to come to you, Craig. Craig Smith, industry lead within City and Guild. Within City and Guild, I guess in a training capacity, not just younger people, but how can we help them be ready for change?
So it's interesting. I mean, we're seeing, I guess, slightly different to this from a sustainability point of view, much more drive around embedding sustainability through all qualifications and apprenticeships and whatever that training might be. So I think in a similar guise, I think there's a need for those kind of cross-cutting themes of sustainability, technology, whatever that might be. I think also in the industry, there's a lot of people who've kind of risen through the ranks over the years in leadership positions who've got the right hard skills, but not necessarily the soft skills. So I think further up the organisation, sometimes it's leadership skills. Further down, it's just that kind of self-management and that readiness for change. So I think there is at the top, how do we help leaders support others in the business through this kind of change programme? And technology adoption, but then also helping people further down the organisation to be ready and kind of help themselves and lead themselves and not kind of fear the new technology or fear the change.
Right, so removing that fear. So talking about changes, we were talking, Richard Smith, Head of Innovation at NHBC, is that right? You were talking about a lot of regulations coming in and keeping up with that and that change. So what technologies and techniques are you seeing that you can adapt to and use to help adapt to that change?
Okay, so from a builder point of view, we are seeing builders trial different technologies in construction to build more efficiently and better to ready for the future home standard, which is really encouraging actually. The challenge there is with the technologies and making sure those technologies are fit and appropriate for use, and the end user is not the guinea pig in that technology trial. So that's something we feel quite strongly about at NHBC. From that point of view, we're looking at different methodologies to retrieve information as part of the assessment process for future home standards. There's more of a requirement now to provide evidence during construction for photographic evidence. It does represent a challenge because site managers traditionally manage sites, and now they've got to take photos of construction and send those through, and those photos have got to be quite effective, and they've got to work through an app, and it's a very different process for somebody who started as a bricklayer or a carpenter or whatever. So there's some challenges there, but I'm quite optimistic that developers are sort of trying these to see what works and what doesn't work. I always think that it's interesting that as part of an evolution process, reflecting sort of progress that has been made over time, I think a lot of it is slightly forced because of regulatory change. But as we go forward with the Building Safety Regulator and the Building Safety Act, I think there'll be more evidence required on accountability of all the different trades, and I certainly think that digitisation and technology will play a much bigger part in that aspect.
Right, so a lot to be thinking about there. Colin Johnson, if I can come to you as Managing Director of D-Gauge, with a pure business head on, how can we use techniques and technologies and adapt them to help the business aim?
Well, I think I like to pick up on the idea that technology is a theme and not a tool. I think sometimes there's big confusions that we'll put in a tool or process, and that is associated with a cost. So I think from our perspective, it's about trying to define what we're trying to do with the technology. Are we trying to digitise? We're trying to capture more data, and once we understand that, putting it to the team really to figure out what best practices are out there which we can use. That's always quite good, and to be clear on what we're trying to achieve. Are we trying to save cost? Are we trying to demonstrate it? Because sometimes it comes down to cost being the main driver in a business sense. But as a business, if we've got a theme to either be more sustainable or to be more transparent to the customer, that may have a higher cost implication, but it allows us to add more value to our customers. So I think it's been really clear what technology is trying to do, and also acknowledging that their technology tools, equipment can be an upfront cost, and trying to make sure that we don't always capture that straight away. Or how do we merge that into the business plan over many years so that we're not upfront putting it straight onto our customers? That's quite key for us, I think.
Adam Turk, Chief Executive of SideRise. So what's your take on this question?
Well, I think it's really, really interesting because you ask where are we in terms of utilising new technology. I think there's a lot of fantastic technology out there. The construction industry generally has always been very, very poor at the growth stage of a product life cycle. It gets great innovation, you get a lot of early adopters, some of the big boys get around it and can see the benefit. But the industry is very fragmented. We've got lots and lots and lots of small companies, lots of SMEs involved in construction, and actually getting that wider group to take that technology on board so that we can start to become much more mature is much harder. And so during that stage, you get a lot of confusion. You end up with your VHS versus Betamax because everybody sees that opportunity. So before the innovation has become quite mature, there's lots of different flavours going on. And I think they're the things that we need to work on. Better communications, better pulling in that wider fragmented base, much more pull versus push. So if you get somebody like a big contractor or a big developer to take a technology on board, they're more likely to pull all of their supply chain, all of those SMEs into it. But I think we've got to accept it's not as much about the innovation itself, it's about the adoption of that innovation, it's about training, it's about competence, and it's about really spreading that message that gets everybody on board. And I think you'd start to see a lot more success from the innovations around.
And whilst we can talk about that, how can we do that?
Well, I think we need to really work a lot more on training and competence. I think we need to get, when there's new technologies, you get somebody who's been doing it for 30 years one way, why would they change? So you've got to drive that training, because as soon as they start using the new system, they'll go, wow, fantastic, what a difference. So a much broader spread of training and competence, getting people really familiar with new technologies, getting them used to using it, and then driving that early adoption into a mature product that way.
We've heard about the impact of the last 2 years. So coming back to you, Craig, on behalf of City and Guilds, has training been impacted by this period?
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly through the first lockdown, training stopped for most businesses pretty much, unless it was safety critical. I think there's been much more of a bounce back now. I think at the younger end though, there's less people aspiring to go to college and kind of heading through that route. I'm not sure if that's because more people are just going straight into the labour market, but if you look at certainly in construction, there's less people coming out of college having done construction courses over the last couple of years. Apprenticeship numbers are down generally, so yeah, there's definitely been an impact, and like I said, there's been some bounce back, but we're still not at pre-pandemic levels, so there's definitely work to be done on encouraging people into kind of not just the construction industry, but I think just into industry and pursuing college vocational routes generally.
And David, you're sort of rounding the conversation off by coming back to you as Technical Director of D-Gauge. What's your sort of summary? What's your take on listening to all of the experts here on this particular question?
Well, I think there's a common theme. like Colin, I tend to agree that we have to think about what we're trying to do in this, because it's no point in using technology for the sake of it, for example. But all of the points that have been made are very valid. I'm particularly interested in your last point about training and competence, because one of the other ways of looking at training and competence, and forgive me if this is controversial, but one of the things is to make sure that if you look at innovative solutions, to minimise the needs for that, so that you can actually optimise the people. For example, in our business, the traditional way, if we're supplying software systems, for example, the traditional way would be, here's a software system, there's a business model in selling the training for that software system. Actually, that's a bit of an old model now. It's far better, given the way that people use software intuitively, to actually have software that doesn't need training on it. And therefore, I think we have to start to look at the whole context of training as being, how does the industry, or how do industries work together to optimise the balance between the needs for individual training on people's, focusing it, and making sure that what we're giving people to do doesn't need as much, or doesn't need as much specific, or is adaptable, that it allows the changes to occur. If you want to introduce a change, do you have to have a training course? Do you have to put someone through some specific training just because something's changed and because the regulations say that you must actually be certified to use something? So I think we have to think big time around that. But I think you also mentioned the pandemic, and I think that one of the things that we probably all recognise is that over the last 2 years we've all been looking at Zoom and Teams and using that for our meetings. And people have been saying, well, it's far more efficient, isn't it? Because you can get your 1 hour meeting done in an hour as opposed to having a 2 hour meeting or a 3 hour meeting. But I think what it's done is it's removed the personal element to it, where a lot of the things that go around in the background that make things happen have actually made things happen. And I think that's the thing that's missing now. And I think, until we get back to the point where we've learned how to interact with each other, then I think we've got that problem to solve as well.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for a very interesting discussion. Thank you.